First thing we'll do is make the welt flap. So we're gonna just take two of our welt pieces, pin them together, right sides together, and then stitch around the outside. Trim the corners of your seam allowance. Careful not to go through your stitching. Press for a few seconds here. Flip over, press again on both sides. You might have to insert a tool here to make sure your corners are stiff. Now we're going to put our welt piece onto our front. So here's the side seam. That's where the notches are in the pattern. I marked it with pins so it's easier to see. So we're just going to line that up there, and we're going to sew that on the machine real quick, just from here to here. Take your pocket bag pieces, put one over where the welt is, and we'll stitch that down. And take the other one and put it on the front side bodice piece between the notches, and then stitch that down and serge. Once you've sewn on the pocket bag and serged the seams, I've gone ahead and pressed them open. I've pressed the pocket bag away from the other piece. Then we're going to put it right sides together. So down here, around the pocket bag, and down. Once the inside is sewn together, you want to give it a press, and we're going to make sure that this flap is pointing toward the side seam. Press that down, then we're going to stitch just along this edge and this edge. It should now look like this, and you should be able to put your hand inside here. Make the back bodice. Stitch and press the back vent piece so it lays flat. Then take the side back bodice piece and sew right sides together from the top along the edge of the vent. Attach the front and back pieces together. Take the front and back pieces and put them right sides together. Match the shoulder seams to the notch and match the side seams. Sew along the shoulder from the notch and down the side seam. Make capped sleeve. Take your 4 pieces and put two them together, right sides to right sides. Pin them and then stitch the top and bottom and the piece that's bended in. Trim the excess sleeve allowance from the corners to reduce bulk. You want to trim close to your stitching line, but you don't want to cut your stitches. Flip right sides out, then use a pencil or something else to poke out the corners. Once you're happy with the corners, press. Take your sleeve piece and pin it to the armhole, right sides together, with the point of the sleeve matching the shoulder seam. Pin down at this shoulder point the notches on the front and back. Once it's pinned in place, sew the sleeve on with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. To bind the armhole, you'll need a strip of bias binding 2 inches wide. You can either use store-bought binding or you can make your own. In this case, I made my own out of scrap fabric. To make your own, you can cut a strip of fabric 2 inches wide on the bias, so that's like the diagonal of the fabric, and it needs to be long enough to go around your armhole. Pin it to your armhole, right sides together, all the way around your armhole. Stitch it with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once you've sewn your binding on around the armhole, flip the binding to the wrong side. You might find it easier to press here first. Fold the edge under 1/2 inch so that it covers the raw edge of your fabric. Your binding should be folded under so that there's no raw edges showing. Very carefully sew the binding in place so it stays folded under. As I'm sewing this, I'm going a little bit slower than usual, and I'm with my finger in front of the machine, making sure that I can feel that the binding is there folded under. I sewed the underarm area first, then I sewed the binding underneath the sleeve so that I couldn't actually see the top stitching of the binding on my sleeve. Next, we're going to attach the facing. Take the neck facing piece and pin it to the front facing, right sides together. It should end at the notch on the front facing piece. Stitch the neck facing on. Flip the facing so it's right sides together with the bodice and match the seams. I like to match the shoulder seams first on the bodice and facing and pin it there before pinning it all the way around and down the front on both sides. Once it's all pinned in place, sew it down one side of the front facing around the neck and then down the other side. Press once you're done. Trim the excess corners of the seam allowance in the lapel area. This helps reduce bulk and lets you get a sharper corner. You might need to also insert a tool like a pencil to help poke your corners out. Once your corners look good, press again. In order for the neck area to lay flat, you need to clip into the seam allowance of the neck curve, otherwise it will pull. The clipping in the seam allowance just helps the neck piece be able to move a bit more. You can see once I'm done here that the neck area has more movement. It's time to hem our vest. We're just going to do a simple double turned hem. Fold your hem up 1/2 inch, then fold up another 1/2 inch and pin it in place. Top stitch your hem all the way along the bottom edge of the vest. Now it's time to secure our facing in place. Fold the edge of the facing in, so about 1/2 inch, and then pin it on. You'll really want to make sure that the facing is laying flat and smooth. If your facing's pulled too far in and you sew it in that way, your facing will end up puckering the entire vest. So you really want to make sure it's laying nice and smooth. Pin it all the way around. Pin it around the back neck and down the other side. Sew around the whole thing. Mark the buttonhole placement on the right side of the vest according to the markings on your pattern. As a general rule, you want your buttonholes to be about 1/8 of an inch wider than your button. Then sew your buttonholes. Once you've sewn them, cut them open with a pair of small, sharp scissors or with a seam ripper. Be careful not to cut through your thread. Once the buttonholes are all done, it's time to sew on your button. I like to put my needle through the hole of the buttonhole, secure the thread to the fabric, and then sew my button on.